There is a primal instinct buried deep inside every human being that alerts us when we are not alone. It is that sudden prickle on the back of your neck. It is the feeling of heavy eyes boring into your skull from across a crowded room. Usually, when we turn around, we find nothing but empty space and we laugh it off as paranoia. But what happens when you turn around and there is no one there, but you know for a fact that the eyes are still watching? What happens when the watcher is not a ghost or a monster, but a person who knows your name, knows your children's names, and knows exactly which room you sleep in? For one family in New Jersey, the American dream of owning a perfect home turned into a psychological torture chamber, not because of what was inside the house, but because of who was outside waiting in the shadows. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. The year was 2014. Derek and Maria Broaddus were a couple who seemed to have figured out the game of life. Derek was a senior vice president at an insurance company, and Maria was also successful in her career. They had worked hard, they had saved their money, and now they were ready to upgrade their lives. They had 3 young children, and they wanted to raise them in a place that felt safe, a place that felt grand. They set their sights on the town of Westfield, New Jersey. Westfield is the kind of town that looks like it was built for a movie set. It is affluent, quiet, and filled with tree-lined streets and massive, beautiful colonial-style homes. It is the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and children ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria closed the deal on their dream home. It was located at 657 Boulevard. It was a magnificent 6-bedroom house built in 1905. It cost them nearly $1.4 million. It was the most expensive house on the block, and it was perfect. It had a wide porch, a sprawling lawn, and big windows that let in the sunlight. But almost immediately after they signed the papers, the feeling of perfection began to crack. Derek and Maria decided they were not going to move in right away. They wanted to do some renovations first. They wanted to refinish the hardwood floors, paint the walls, and update the kitchen. So for the first few weeks, the house was empty at night. During the day, contractors would come and go, and Derek would stop by to check on the progress. It was a warm evening in June, just 3 days after closing. Derek was at the house alone. He was checking the mail. The previous owners had already moved out, so the mailbox was mostly empty. But there was one letter inside. It was a thick, white, card-sized envelope. On the front, in clumsy, blocky handwriting, it was addressed simply to the new owner. Derek probably thought it was a welcome note from a neighbor, maybe an invitation to a block party. He stood on the porch, under the soft glow of the setting sun, and tore open the envelope. Inside was a typed note. The letter began cordially enough. It said, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood." But then the tone shifted. It shifted so fast and so violently that Derek felt his stomach drop. The letter continued. "How did you end up here? Did the force within 657 Boulevard call to you? I have been controlling 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on and kindly sell it when I asked. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now you are too, Broaddus family." The writer misspelled their name as Broaddus instead of Broaddus, but the message was clear. Then came the part that made Derek freeze. The letter said, "My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out." Derek looked around the street. It was twilight. The street was quiet. He saw a few cars parked, a few lights on in the houses nearby. Was someone looking at him right now? The letter went on. It got worse. "I see you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was intended to be. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy." And then the writer turned their attention to the children. "You have children. I have seen them. So many names that I need to recall. I used to be the one who roamed the halls of 657 Boulevard in the 1960s. Will you bring the young blood to play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. The letter ended with a sign-off that would become legendary in the annals of true crime. Welcome, my friends. Welcome. Let the party begin. Signed, The Watcher. Derek rushed inside the house. He turned off all the lights. He called the police immediately. When the officers arrived, they read the letter. They were disturbed, but there wasn't much they could do. A letter technically wasn't a physical assault. They told Derek to keep quiet about it to his neighbors, because any one of them could be the culprit. Derek drove back to his old home where Maria and the kids were staying. He showed her the letter. She read it and burst into tears. The safety of their new life had evaporated before it even began. The next day, Derek and Maria went back to the house. They scanned the neighborhood with suspicious eyes. Who could it be? They looked at the house next door. The Langford family lived there. They were an old family in the area. One of the brothers, Michael Langford, was described by neighbors as a bit eccentric. He was known to walk through the neighborhood and sometimes peek into people's yards. Derek wondered if it was him, but without proof, they could do nothing. 2 weeks passed. The renovations continued, but the joy was gone. Derek and Maria were on edge. They stopped bringing the kids to the house. Then, the second letter arrived. If the first letter was an introduction, the second letter was a threat. The Watcher had been busy. The Watcher had been studying them. The letter read, "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what is in the walls yet? In time they will." Then, the Watcher proved just how close they really were. The writer correctly identified the children by their nicknames. "I am pleased to know your names now and the names of the young blood you have brought to me." The writer listed the birth order of the children. Then, the writer referenced specific things the children were doing. "I saw the little girl painting on her easel on the enclosed porch. Is she the artist in the family?" Maria felt sick. She had set up an easel on the porch for her daughter just a few days prior. It was set back from the street. You could not see it unless you were standing very close to the house or looking through a powerful telescope. The letter continued, taunting them. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all of the secrets it holds? Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. The writer then made a strange reference to the house itself, treating it like a living, breathing entity. The house is crying from all of the pain it is going through. You have changed it and made it so fancy, you are stealing its history. It cries for the past and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. The letter ended with a chilling promise. Who am I? I am the Watcher, and have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now, you are too. Derek and Maria were terrified. They stopped the renovations. They hired a private investigator. They hired a former FBI agent. They installed high-tech security cameras everywhere. But the cameras saw nothing. The Watcher was smart. They never came close enough to be caught on tape, or perhaps they knew exactly where the blind spots were. The investigation focused on the neighbors. The police questioned Michael Langford. They questioned everyone on the block, but everyone had an alibi or simply denied it. DNA analysis was done on the saliva from the envelope flap. It determined that the sender was likely female, but there were no matches in the database. The family was stuck in a nightmare. They had a $1.4 million house that they were too afraid to sleep in. They were paying the mortgage, the taxes, and the utilities for a home that was effectively a prison. Weeks turned into months. The story broke in the local news, and then it went national. People from all over the country were talking about the Watcher. Internet sleuths tried to solve the case. Some people accused the Broaddus family of sending the letters to themselves to get out of the sale, which was absurd because they were losing money every single day. Finally, a third letter arrived. This one was angry. The watcher was impatient. "Where have you gone to? 657 Boulevard is missing you." The writer seemed furious that the family had not moved in. "I am in charge. I will wait. I will wait for you to move in." Derek and Maria made a heartbreaking decision. They could not move their children into that house. The risk was too high. The thought of putting their young blood in a place where a stalker was obsessed with them was unbearable. They put the house up for sale. But who would buy a house that came with a stalker? The rumors were everywhere. Potential buyers would love the house. But as soon as they heard about the letters, they would run. The value of the property plummeted. Desperate to cover the costs, Derek and Maria found a renter, a brave family who agreed to lease the house. But even then, the nightmare did not end. Shortly after the renters moved in, another letter arrived. This one was more violent than the others. 12. Violent winds and bitter cold. To the vile and spiteful Derek III and his W4-inch of a wife, Maria. The writer threatened to physically harm the family. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire. Maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away, but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day. The renters moved out. The house sat empty again. Years passed. The mystery remained unsolved. The police exhausted every lead. They looked at old enemies of the previous owners. They looked at jealous neighbors. They even looked at a local gamer who played violent video games as a specific character named the Watcher, but nothing stuck. Finally, in 2019, 5 years after they bought it, Derek and Maria sold the house. They sold it for roughly $950,000. They took a loss of almost $500,000. They had never spent a single night in the master bedroom. They had never hosted a single holiday dinner in the dining room. Their children never played in the basement. The new owners moved in. And interestingly, as far as the public knows, the letters stopped. The Watcher, it seems, had either passed away, moved on, or was simply satisfied that the Broaddus family was gone. But the psychological scar remains. To this day, the case of the Watcher of Westfield remains one of the most unsettling, unsolved mysteries in modern American history. It touches on our deepest fears. We all want to believe that our home is our castle. We want to believe that when we lock the front door, the world stays out. But this story proves that sometimes the world is already inside, watching, waiting, and writing. Think about the sheer audacity of it. Someone in that neighborhood, maybe the nice lady walking her dog, or the old man watering his lawn, was writing these letters. They were watching a family crumble. They were watching the police cars come and go, and they were likely laughing. There is a profound lesson to be found in the story of 657 Boulevard, one that resonates deeply with spiritual teachings regarding privacy and the nature of worldly possessions. In life, we are often driven by the desire to acquire the best. We want the biggest house, the finest car, the most enviable lifestyle. We believe that these things will bring us peace and security. Derek and Maria Broaddus bought a mansion believing it was the pinnacle of their success, the ultimate sanctuary for their family. But instead, it became their greatest source of fear. This teaches us that the true value of a home is not in its square footage or its price tag, but in the peace it provides. A small, humble hut where one feels safe is infinitely better than a palace where one feels hunted. Furthermore, there is a concept in many moral traditions, including the Islamic faith, about the sanctity of privacy, known as aura. A person's home is a sacred space. It is a place where the outside world should not intrude. To violate that privacy, to peer into someone's life and spread fear, is a grievous act of oppression. The Watcher did not just trespass on a property. They trespassed on the soul of a family. This story also serves as a reminder of the destructive power of envy and the evil eye. The Watcher was clearly obsessed with the house and angry that someone else possessed it. Their jealousy turned into a toxic fixation that destroyed the peace of others. It reminds us to be humble with our blessings and to seek protection not from physical walls, but from a spiritual steadfastness. We often display our lives for the world to see, especially in the age of social media, forgetting that not everyone looking at us wishes us well. The Broaddus family was living the dream, and that dream attracted a nightmare. So, the next time you are sitting in your living room and you feel that sudden urge to close the blinds, even though it is pitch black outside, listen to that instinct. We like to think we are safe in our homes. We like to think that the walls protect us. But walls have windows. And you never really know who is standing on the other side of the glass, watching, waiting, and wondering when the young blood will come out to play. Thanks for reading. There is a kind of silence that you only find in the deep, rolling countryside of rural Ireland. It is not an empty silence, it is a heavy, watchful silence. The hills there are incredibly green, soaked in rain and mist, and they are dotted with structures that are older than the pyramids of Egypt. For thousands of years, the people living on this land have followed an unwritten rule, a pact made with the history of the soil itself. You respect the land, and the land lets you live. You do not disturb the resting places of the dead. You do not cut the lone hawthorn trees that stand in the middle of fields. And you certainly never, ever touch the ancient stone tombs that mark the gateways to the other world. Most people, even in the modern age, respect these rules. They might call it superstition, but they still walk around the fairy forts rather than through them. They still lower their voices when they pass a dolmen. But sometimes a person comes along who believes they are too powerful for old stories. They believe that their money and their influence make them untouchable. They look at a sacred pile of rocks and see nothing but an obstacle to be bulldozed. This is the story of a man who reached the absolute pinnacle of human success. A man who had everything the world could offer and then lost it all in a way that defies logical explanation. It is a story about hubris, about the terrifying speed of a fall from grace, and about what happens when you disturb things that should have been left alone. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Let us go back to the early 1970s. In a small, quiet corner of County Cavan, Ireland, there was a young man named Sean Quinn. He did not come from money. In fact, he started with almost nothing. He was the son of a small farmer, and he knew what it meant to work until his hands were raw. He borrowed about £100 to start a business, digging gravel out of his family farm. He had one truck, a shovel, and a relentless drive to succeed. And succeed he did. Sean Quinn was not just a hard worker. He was brilliant. He had an instinct for business that was almost supernatural. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he built an empire. He moved from gravel to cement, then he moved from cement to glass manufacturing, then he moved into insurance. Everything he touched turned to gold. People in Ireland called him the Mighty Quinn. He was the ultimate success story, the local boy who conquered the world. By the year 2008, Sean Quinn was the richest man in Ireland. His personal net worth was estimated to be around $6 billion. To put that in perspective, he had more money than he could ever spend in 100 lifetimes. He owned wind farms, radiators, factories, and plastics companies. He was a billionaire in a country that was experiencing an economic boom. He was treated like royalty. Politicians wanted to be seen with him. Banks were begging to lend him money. He was the king of the border region. And like many kings throughout history, he decided he wanted to build a castle. This castle was not made of stone walls and moats, but of luxury suites, golf courses, and ballrooms. He called it the Sleeve Russell Hotel. It was his pride and joy. He wanted it to be the finest hotel in the entire country, a place where the wealthy and the powerful would come to relax. The construction was massive, the landscaping was meticulous, everything had to be perfect. But there was a problem. On the grounds of the hotel, right where Sean Quinn wanted to build the main access infrastructure, there sat a pile of rocks. Now, to an outsider, or perhaps to an American tourist, these rocks might look like nothing special, just a jumble of gray stones covered in moss and ivy. But these were not just rocks. This was the Aughrim Wedge Tomb. It was a megalithic burial site that dated back to the Bronze Age. We are talking about a structure that was built around 2,000 years before Christ was born. It was 4,000 years old. For 4 millennia, the people of that area had walked past that tomb and left it alone. In Irish folklore, these wedge tombs are not just graves. They are considered the dwelling places of the As Sea, or the good people. We know them as fairies, but in Irish mythology, fairies are not cute little winged creatures like Tinkerbell. They are powerful, ancient, and often vengeful spirits who guard the land. The belief is absolute. If you disturb a fairy fort or a tomb, you invite a curse upon yourself and your family. It is said that you will lose your wealth, your health, and your peace of mind. When the architects and engineers were laying out the plans for the Sleeve Russell Hotel, they saw the tomb. They knew what it was. Local historians and archaeologists contacted the Quinn group. They were respectful, but they were firm. They advised the billionaire to change his plans. They said he should move the road. They said he should redesign the entrance. They told him, in no uncertain terms, that the tomb should remain exactly where it had stood for 4,000 years. They warned that moving it would be a destruction of heritage and, for those who believed, a temptation of fate. But Sean Quinn was a man who had moved mountains to get where he was. He had blasted through rock to mine cement. He had crushed obstacles his entire life. He looked at this ancient burial site, and he did not see a sacred gateway. He saw a pile of rocks that was in his way. He saw an imperfection in his architectural vision. He was a man of logic, a man of modern industry. He did not believe in fairies. He did not believe in curses. He believed in engineering and profit. So, in the early 1990s, Sean Quinn gave the order. He did not just pave over it. He had the tomb excavated. The stones were dug up, one by one. The resting place of the ancients was dismantled. He did not destroy the stones, however. In a move that perhaps he thought was respectful, but many locals saw as even more insulting, he had the tomb moved. He relocated the ancient stones to a different spot on the hotel grounds, arranging them neatly as a garden feature. It was reduced to a decoration, a tourist attraction. The hotel opened, and it was a massive success. It was beautiful. People flocked to it. For a long time, it seemed like the warnings were just nonsense. Sean Quinn continued to get richer. His empire expanded into Europe and beyond. He was on top of the world. He had challenged the ancient laws of the land, and he had won. Or so he thought. But the thing about curses, if you believe in them, is that they do not always strike immediately like a lightning bolt. Sometimes they are a slow poison. They wait until you are at your absolute highest point so that the fall is that much more devastating. The year 2008 arrived. Sean Quinn was worth $6 billion. But he had made a gamble, a very dangerous financial gamble. He had been secretly buying shares in a bank called Anglo-Irish Bank. He was not just buying normal shares. He was using a complex financial instrument called contracts for difference. Basically, he was betting huge amounts of money that the stock price of the bank would keep going up. He was so confident, he felt he could not lose. He eventually owned a massive percentage of the bank, but no one knew the full extent of his exposure. Then, the global financial crisis hit. The markets began to wobble. The stock price of Anglo-Irish Bank started to dip, then it started to slide, then it started to crash. In the old stories, when the fairies strike, they take away the abundance of the farm. The milk turns sour, the cattle die, the crops wither. In the modern world, the destruction looked like margin calls. As the bank's share price dropped, Quinn had to put up more cash to cover his losses. He poured millions, then billions of his family's wealth into the bank to try and save his investment. It was like throwing gold into a black hole. The money just vanished. The bank collapsed. It was one of the biggest corporate failures in the history of the state. The Irish government had to step in, and when the dust settled, Sean Quinn's $6 billion fortune was gone. It was not just diminished. It was obliterated. He owed the bank billions. In 2011, the unimaginable happened. The man who had been the King of Ireland, the man who had flown in private helicopters and dined with presidents, was declared bankrupt. He had less than nothing. The authorities seized his assets, they took his cement factories, they took his insurance company, and, most symbolically of all, they took the Sleeve Russell Hotel, the very place where he had moved the tomb. He was stripped of the jewel in his crown. The tomb sat there on the grounds, silent and unmoving, while the man who moved it was escorted off the property. But the nightmare was not over. The curse, if you want to call it that, was not done with him. It came for his freedom. Sean Quinn was accused of trying to hide assets from the bank. He was found in contempt of court. In November of 2012, a judge sentenced the former billionaire to 9 weeks in prison. Imagine the scene. A man who was once the wealthiest figure in the land, sitting in a small, cold prison cell. He had lost his reputation, he had lost his business, he had humiliated his family. His son was also sent to prison for contempt of court. His nephew was involved in the legal battles as well. The destruction was total. It was comprehensive. Every single pillar of his life had crumbled. And then, the story took a turn that was darker than any financial spreadsheet. It turned violent. As the banks took over the Quinn empire, tensions in the local community rose. There were people who were loyal to Quinn, people who felt he had been treated unfairly by the system, but there were also dark elements at play. In September of 2019, a man named Kevin Lunny, who was a senior executive running the companies that used to belong to Quinn, was driving home from work. It was around 6:40 p.m. He was close to his house. Suddenly, another car rammed into him. Masked men jumped out, they smashed his windows, dragged him out of his vehicle, and threw him into the trunk of their car. They drove him to a horse box across the border. For 2.5 hours, they tortured him. This was not just a beating. This was a ritualistic level of violence. They broke his leg with a wooden bat. They sliced his face with a knife. They poured bleach over him to destroy DNA evidence. And in a chilling detail that sounds like something from a horror movie, they used a knife to carve the letters QIG into his chest. They dumped him on the side of a road in the middle of the night, bleeding and broken. He survived, but the message was clear. The collapse of the Quinn empire had unleashed a darkness that was poisoning the entire community. Sean Quinn himself appeared on television and condemned the attack. He said he had nothing to do with it, and there is no evidence to suggest he did. But the locals looked at the chaos, the violence, the bankruptcy, and the ruin, and they looked back at the Sleeve Russell Hotel. They remembered the tomb. They remembered the warning. You do not touch the dwelling places of the ancient ones. You do not place your own ambition above the history of the land. Today, Sean Quinn lives a relatively quiet life. He is still a well-known figure, but his empire is gone. The Sleeve Russell Hotel is owned by someone else, but the Aughrim Wedge tomb is still there. It sits on the grounds, a pile of gray stones that looks exactly as it did 4,000 years ago, minus the location change. It has outlasted the Bronze Age chieftains. It has outlasted the High Kings of Ireland. And it outlasted the $6 billion fortune of Sean Quinn. There is a profound lesson to be found in the ruins of this modern empire, a lesson that resonates with spiritual wisdom. In life, there is a boundary between human ambition and the unseen forces that govern reality. We often walk through the world with a sense of ownership, believing that because we have money or technology or power, we are the masters of the earth. We believe we can reshape the world to fit our desires, ignoring the traditions and the sanctity of what was there before us. But true wisdom lies in humility. It lies in understanding that we are small travelers in a vast history. There is a concept that warns us against arrogance, against walking upon the earth with insolence. When a person believes they are greater than the established order, when they believe they can displace what is sacred just to build a path for their own convenience, they are challenging a power much greater than themselves. The downfall of the arrogant is often swift and absolute. serving as a reminder that we do not own the earth. We are merely guests upon it. The wealth we accumulate is fragile. It is like a spider's web, easily swept away by the winds of destiny. The only thing that truly lasts is the respect we show to the creation and the humility with which we walk through our lives. We must lower our heads in the face of history and mystery, for when we raise our heads too high in pride, we are often forced to bow them in shame. So, the next time you are walking through the countryside, whether it is in Ireland or anywhere else, and you see a strange pile of rocks, or a lonely tree standing in a field, or an old ruin that looks forgotten, do not just see it as an obstacle. Do not see it as something to be moved or bought. Show it some respect. Walk around it. Leave it be. Because you never know who or what might be watching. And you never know what the price might be for disturbing the peace of the past. All right, that brings us to the end of that story. However, I have another one lined up that is every bit as gripping as the last, so make sure you stick around until the end. There is a specific kind of darkness that hangs over London when the fog rolls in off the Thames. It is a thick, heavy blanket that muffles sound and distorts light, making the modern city feel like it has slipped back in time. In the northern part of this sprawling metropolis sits a place that seems to have been forgotten by the 20th century. It is a place of crumbling stone and tangled roots, a city of the dead that covers 37 acres of steep hillside. This is Highgate Cemetery. Today, if you visit Highgate, you will find a manicured tourist attraction where you must pay admission to see the graves of famous philosophers and writers. But if you could travel back in time to the late 1960s and early 1970s, you would not find a tourist attraction. You would find a nightmare. Back then, Highgate was a ruin. It was a Gothic wilderness where the tombs had been cracked open by tree roots and the vaults had been looted by vandals. It was a place where the sun seemed to struggle to reach the ground. And in this decaying necropolis, something strange began to happen. A hysteria took root in the minds of the local people, a fear so primal and so intense that it caused thousands of ordinary citizens to grab wooden stakes and hammers and hunt for a monster. This is not a story from the Middle Ages. This happened in the age of rock and roll and space travel. It is a story about a vampire, but not the kind you see in movies. The real monster in this story was not the thing sleeping in the coffin. The real monster was the madness that woke up in the city. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. To truly understand the terror that gripped London, we have to set the scene. Highgate Cemetery was built in 1839 during the height of the Victorian era. The Victorians had a strange obsession with death. They built their cemeteries to be grand, magnificent places filled with Egyptian avenues and circle of Lebanon cedar trees and massive stone mausoleums that looked like small houses. It was the place to be buried if you were wealthy and important. But as the decades passed, the money ran out. By the time the 1960s arrived, the company that owned the cemetery was bankrupt. The gates were left rusted and broken, the walls were crumbling, the forest took over. It became a dense jungle where the ivy grew so thick it completely covered the statues of angels and weeping women. It became a playground for the darker side of London. Occultists and amateur Satanists began breaking in at night to hold rituals in the open crypts. They would draw pentagrams on the floor and chant in languages they did not understand. And perhaps in their ignorance, they invited something in. Or perhaps they just set the stage for the public imagination to run wild. The trouble began in the autumn of 1969. It started as a whisper among the people who lived in the Victorian terraced houses that lined the edges of the cemetery. The locals began to notice a change in the atmosphere. It was not just that the cemetery was creepy, it was that it felt occupied. People walking down Swains Lane, which is a steep, narrow road that runs directly between the two halves of the cemetery, began to report terrifying encounters. One evening, a man was walking his dog past the cemetery gates. It was around 11 p.m. and the street was deserted. The fog was clinging to the cobblestones. Suddenly, his dog, a large retriever that was usually fearless, stopped dead in its tracks. The hair on the dog's back stood straight up, and it let out a low, guttural growl that the man had never heard before. The man looked toward the cemetery gate. Standing there behind the rusted iron bars was a figure. It was incredibly tall, perhaps 7 feet in height. It was dressed in dark clothing that looked like a long cloak, but it was the face that froze the man's blood. He described it as having a deathly white complexion, but the features were blurred, as if the face was not quite solid. The only thing that was sharp and clear were the eyes, 2 burning hypnotic points of light that seemed to drill into his mind. The man felt a wave of psychic exhaustion wash over him, as if his energy was being drained away by the mere presence of the entity. He managed to drag his whimpering dog away and run down the hill, but the feeling of being watched never left him. This was not an isolated incident. Another witness, a respectable accountant, was walking home late one night when he lost track of time. He claimed that he suddenly found himself standing in front of the gate, unable to move, paralyzed by a force he could not see. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, until suddenly the spell broke and he ran home in a panic. Couples who used the dark lane for privacy reported seeing a dark shape that did not walk, but glided inches above the ground, drifting through the solid iron gates as if they were made of smoke. Then the physical evidence began to appear. And this is where the story takes a turn from a ghost story to something more visceral. People began finding dead animals in the area. Foxes were the most common victims. Highgate was full of foxes, but these ones were not killed by cars or dogs. Their bodies were found lying on the paths inside the cemetery or in the gardens of nearby houses. When the bodies were examined, there were no signs of external trauma. No broken bones, no gashes, but there was a throat wound, and the bodies were completely drained of blood. It was as if something had fed on them. On February 6, 1970, the dam broke. The local newspaper, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, published a letter from a reader. The writer described seeing a gray figure flitting among the graves and asked if anyone else had seen it. The response was overwhelming. The newspaper office was inundated with letters. Everyone seemed to have a story. The fear that had been bubbling under the surface exploded into the public consciousness. Into this volatile mix stepped 2 men who would become the architects of the hysteria. Their names were David Farrant and Sean Manchester. If you were writing a movie, you could not invent 2 more perfect rivals. David Farrant was a dark, brooding figure. He was a local Wiccan and occultist who spent his nights exploring the cemetery. He told the press that the entity was a dark ley line force, a gathering of negative energy caused by the satanic rituals. He claimed to have seen the creature up close, describing it as having eyes that burned like coals. He was mysterious and spoke in riddles. Sean Manchester was the opposite. He was theatrical, loud, and charismatic. He claimed to be a bishop of the Old Catholic Church and a professional vampire hunter. When the reports of the bloodless foxes came out, Manchester went on television and made a shocking declaration. He told the people of London that they were not dealing with a ghost. He said they were dealing with a king vampire of the undead. Manchester spun an elaborate and terrifying backstory. He claimed that in the 18th century, a nobleman from Wallachia, a region in Romania famous for its vampire legends, had traveled to England. This nobleman was a practitioner of the black arts and a vampire. Manchester said that when this nobleman died, his followers brought his body to London and buried him in a secret vault in Highgate. According to Manchester, the modern Satanists who had been performing rituals in the cemetery had accidentally woken him up. Now, the king vampire was hungry, and he was stalking the streets of London. The media went into a frenzy. It was the perfect story. The clash between Farrant and Manchester became a daily soap opera. They insulted each other in the press. They challenged each other to magical duels. They whipped the public into a state of absolute terror. You have to remember that in 1970, the internet did not exist. People got their news from the papers and the TV, and the papers were telling them that a monster was real. The tension built and built until Friday, March 13, 1970. Friday the 13th. Sean Manchester announced to the world that he was going to lead an official vampire hunt that very night. He said he would enter the catacombs, find the vampire's lair, and drive a stake through its heart. He invited the press to witness the deed. He should have kept his mouth shut. As the sun set over London on that Friday night, the atmosphere in Highgate was electric. It started with a few curious onlookers gathering near the main gates on Swains Lane. Then came the amateur ghost hunters. Then came the thrill seekers. And finally came the mob. By 10:30 p.m., the scene was apocalyptic. The narrow streets around the cemetery were gridlocked with cars, but it was the people on foot who were truly terrifying. Police estimated that hundreds, if not thousands of people had descended on the cemetery. This was not a peaceful crowd. They were a lynch mob, and they were armed. Imagine looking out your window and seeing thousands of your neighbors marching down the street holding homemade wooden stakes sharpened in their garages. They carried heavy iron crucifixes. They held flaming torches. They had pockets full of garlic and vials of holy water. They were shouting and chanting, demanding blood. The police were hopelessly outnumbered. A small detachment of officers tried to hold the line at the main gate, but the pressure of the crowd was too great. With a deafening roar, the mob surged forward. They climbed over the high brick walls, they smashed the locks on the gates, they poured into the cemetery like a flood. Inside the cemetery, it was absolute pandemonium. The darkness was pierced by hundreds of flashlight beams darting in every direction. People were running wild over the graves. They were kicking down the doors of the family vaults. They were smashing the marble angels. They were screaming that they had seen the vampire. Every shadow was a monster. Every rustle of leaves was an attack. Sean Manchester and his group managed to fight their way through the crowd to the terrace catacombs, a row of imposing stone tombs. Manchester claimed that he broke into a specific vault that he believed belonged to the vampire. He said the lid of the coffin had been moved. He prepared to perform an exorcism, but the vampire was gone. Meanwhile, the police were fighting a losing battle to clear the grounds. It took them hours to restore order. They arrested people for carrying offensive weapons. They found people hiding in the bushes, waiting to ambush the undead. By the time the sun came up, the cemetery was a wreck. Graves had been trampled and desecrated. But the horror did not end that night. In fact, the mob violence of March 13 was just the beginning of a much darker chapter. The hunt had normalized the idea of breaking into the cemetery. It had planted a seed in the minds of the disturbed that the bodies in Highgate were not human remains, but monsters that needed to be destroyed. In the months and years that followed, a wave of gruesome desecration swept through the cemetery. This is the part of the story that is hard to stomach because it shows what happens when superstition replaces humanity. In August of 1970, the police were called to the cemetery again. Inside one of the mausoleums near the north gate, they found a scene from a horror movie. A woman's body had been dragged out of her coffin. Her head had been severed from her body. The perpetrators had tried to burn the remains. It was a senseless, brutal act of violence against the defenseless dead. Then came the incident of the Iron Vampire. A vault was found broken open. The coffin inside had been smashed. The skeleton within had been subjected to a ritualistic execution. Someone had driven a heavy iron bar through the chest of the corpse, pinning it to the floor of the tomb. They believed they were killing a vampire, but in reality, they were just mutilating the remains of someone's grandfather or grandmother. But the most chilling discovery came 4 years later in 1974. It was a cold, misty morning when a police patrol car was driving through a quiet neighborhood near the cemetery. The officers noticed a car parked strangely on the side of the road. It was unlocked. One of the officers approached the vehicle and shone his flashlight inside. He recoiled in horror. Sitting in the driver's seat was a corpse. It was not a fresh body. It was a cadaver that had been dug up from the cemetery. The skin was gray and leathery. The body had been propped up behind the steering wheel, its hands placed on the wheel as if it were driving, and the head was missing. Someone had gone into the cemetery in the dead of night, opened a grave, dragged the body out, carried it to the street, and staged this macabre scene. Why? Was it a prank? Was it a ritual? Or was it the final act of the vampire hunters proving that they had conquered death? Both David Farrant and Sean Manchester were eventually targeted by the law. Farrant was arrested in 1974. He was found in a churchyard near Highgate at night, carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. He was eventually charged with damaging memorials and interfering with dead bodies. He was sentenced to prison. In court, he claimed he was being persecuted for his beliefs, but the judge saw it differently. The judge saw a man who had contributed to a hysteria that led to the destruction of a sacred place. Sean Manchester continued to claim victory. He wrote books stating that he had eventually tracked the vampire to a house in nearby Crouch End and destroyed it, but his stories were full of contradictions and impossibilities. The vampire panic eventually faded. The Friends of Highgate Cemetery, a charity organization, took over the management of the grounds. They repaired the walls, locked the gates, and began the slow process of healing the damage. Today, the cemetery is secure, the tombs are sealed, the dead are left in peace. But when you look back at the events of the early 1970s, you have to ask yourself a question. Was there ever a vampire? There is zero scientific evidence to support the existence of a supernatural creature in Highgate. The tall, dark figure was likely a combination of shadows, fog, and the power of suggestion. The dead foxes were likely victims of disease or other predators. These psychic attacks were likely panic attacks induced by fear. However, there was a monster in Highgate, but it was not wearing a cape and fangs. The story of the Highgate vampire is a terrifying case study in mass hysteria. It shows us how quickly the veneer of civilization can crack. We like to believe that we are rational beings living in a scientific age. We think we are immune to the superstitions of the past. But all it took was a couple of rumors in a newspaper and a charismatic storyteller to turn modern Londoners into a medieval mob. It reveals a dark truth about human nature. When we are afraid, we stop thinking. We look for scapegoats. We look for monsters to kill. And in our quest to destroy the monster, we often become the monster ourselves. There is a profound lesson here that touches on the very core of our humanity. There are 3 principles that could have saved the people of London from this madness. The first is the importance of verification. In an age of rumors and sensationalism, we have a duty to use our intellect. We must verify information before we act on it. The mob that stormed the cemetery did not stop to ask for proof. They acted on emotion. They abandoned their reason. When we stop asking for the truth, we become pawns in someone else's game. The second is the danger of superstition. Fear of the unknown is natural, but when we let that fear dictate our actions, we fall into error. Believing in things without foundation leads to chaos. It clouds our judgment and leads us to see enemies where there are none. And the third and most important lesson is about respect for the dead. The most disturbing part of this story is not the vampire, it is the way the bodies were treated. There is a universal value that states the dignity of the dead is equal to the dignity of the living. A grave is a sanctuary. It is the final resting place of a soul that has completed its trial on this earth. To break open a tomb to handle a corpse with violence and to mock the dead is a transgression of the highest order. The people who dragged those bodies out of their coffins thought they were heroes fighting evil, but they were actually committing a supreme act of disrespect. They violated the peace that every human being is entitled to after death. The Highgate vampire was a phantom of the mind. But the damage done to the cemetery and the desecration of the bodies was very real. It stands as a monument to what happens when we let fear win. It is a reminder that the dead deserve our protection and our silence. They have moved on to a realm that belongs to the Creator, and it is not our place to disturb them. So the next time you hear a wild rumor or a scary story that seems too incredible to be true, take a moment to pause. Use your reason. Verify the facts. And remember that the true measure of a society is not how it hunts its monsters, but how it treats its defenseless, both the living and the dead. If you enjoyed this story, please like and share. Stay safe. There's a unique and profound kind of loneliness that can only be found in a city of millions. It's the paradox of being constantly surrounded by humanity, yet feeling completely, utterly disconnected. You see lives being lived through apartment windows, you hear the muffled sounds of conversations you're not a part of, and you exist as a ghost in the periphery of 1,000 strangers' stories. In those first few weeks in a new place, any small, genuine sign of life, Any perceived connection can feel like a lifeline in a vast, indifferent ocean. But sometimes the sounds that drift through the walls are not a comfort. They're a confirmation that you are more alone than you could ever possibly imagine, and that even the dead are closer to their home than you are. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Clara had just moved into the Ainsworth Arms, a pre-war apartment building in a city where she knew not a single soul. She was a graphic designer, having accepted a promising job offer that required her to relocate halfway across the country, leaving behind the comfortable familiarity of her old life. While the days were a whirlwind of new colleagues and challenging projects, the evenings were when the crushing weight of her decision would settle in. Her apartment, 4A, was filled with a chaotic landscape of unpacked boxes and the sterile chemical smell of fresh paint. Its high ceilings seemed to mock her few belongings, making everything look small and lost. The silence was her loudest, most unwelcome companion. The building itself had a certain faded grandeur. The floors creaked with the memory of 1,000 tenants, the old radiator in the corner hissed and clanked like a sleeping dragon, and the walls were notoriously thin. It was on her third night, as she sat on the floor eating tasteless takeout from a box, that she first heard the music. It started softly, a delicate and intricate melody drifting through the wall from the adjacent apartment, 4B. It was a piano. But it wasn't a recording from a stereo. It had the rich, organic, and imperfect sound of a live performance. The melody was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was steeped in a deep, unshakable melancholy. It wasn't just sad. It was a complex tapestry of longing, of a beauty tinged with an irreversible loss. Clara sat perfectly still, her fork hovering in the air, just listening. In the midst of her own profound loneliness, the music didn't feel intrusive. It felt like a shared solitude, a sign that she had a thoughtful, soulful neighbor. In that moment, it was the most profound comfort she had ever known. The music became a nightly ritual, a strange and anonymous connection she began to rely on. Every evening, almost precisely at 9 p.m., the soft, sad notes would begin to float through the wall. The unseen pianist would play for about an hour, always the same series of beautiful, somber compositions, and then would fall silent. Clara never heard anything else from that apartment. No television, no coughing, no footsteps, no voices, just the piano. She started to look forward to it, timing her own evening routine around the performance. It was during that hour that her vast, empty apartment finally started to feel like a home. She would close her eyes and imagine the person playing perhaps an elderly, gentle artist who had lived a long and storied life. After 2 weeks of this nightly recital, her curiosity became unbearable. She had to meet the person who could play with such raw emotion. One afternoon, she wrote a simple, heartfelt note. "I just wanted to say, your piano playing is absolutely beautiful. It's the highlight of my evening. Thank you." Clara from 4A and taped it to the dark, varnished wood of the door to apartment 4B. The next day, the note was still there, untouched. The day after that, it was gone. But she found it, slid under her own door, still folded, unread. Confused, she tried knocking on the door to 4B a few times over the next couple of days. The silence on the other side was a dead, final silence. Yet, every night, like clockwork, the beautiful, heartbreaking music would play. One Saturday, as she was leaving her apartment, she saw the building's superintendent, a friendly older man named Mr. Henderson, meticulously polishing the brass on the mailboxes in the lobby. This was her chance. She struck up a conversation about the building's history, and after a few minutes of pleasant small talk, she casually brought it up. "You know," she said with a warm smile, "I have to say, the person in 4B is an incredible musician. I hear them playing the piano every night. It's just gorgeous. I've been trying to meet them to say so, but they seem very private." Mr. Henderson stopped polishing. The friendly, easy smile on his face didn't just fade, it collapsed. He slowly turned to face her, his expression shifting to one of deep, profound confusion, which then curdled into a weary, unsettling dread. He stared at her. "I'm sorry. What did you just say? Apartment 4B? Yes, my neighbor?" Clara repeated, her own smile starting to feel tight and uncertain. The pianist? Mr. Henderson slowly put down his polishing cloth. His voice was low and serious, all the previous warmth gone. Honey, that's impossible. You must be mistaken. The walls in this old place, they play tricks. Sounds travel. No, I'm sure of it, Clara insisted, a nervous laugh escaping her. It's clear as a bell. Every single night. I promise you, there is someone in there playing the piano. The color drained from Mr. Henderson's face. He looked past her, up the grand staircase, as if picturing the fourth floor. The last tenant in 4B, he said, his voice barely a whisper, was an elderly woman. Her name was Alara Vance. She was a retired concert pianist. A bit of a prodigy in her day, I'm told. She lived in that apartment for almost 50 years. He paused, and his eyes met hers, full of a deep, unsettling pity. She passed away. Right there, in her living room, about 3 months ago. The paramedics said they found her sitting at her piano. He took a shallow breath before delivering the final, devastating detail. She was a recluse in her later years, never left the apartment. She had this one song she'd composed herself, a sad little tune. Her neighbors from back then used to say she played it every single night, without fail. Clara went back to her apartment in a state of numb disbelief. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial. Henderson was old, maybe he was confused, it had to be a squatter, or the sound was coming from upstairs, or anywhere but there. That night, she didn't unpack, she didn't eat, she just sat on her sofa in the oppressive, buzzing dark, staring at the wall that separated her apartment from 4B, and she waited. 9 p.m. came. Then 9, 1. The silence was absolute. A tiny, fragile wave of relief washed over her. It was over. And then it started. The first soft, melancholic note drifted through the wall, as clear, as pure, and as beautiful as ever. It was followed by the next, and the next, until the full, haunting melody filled her silent apartment. But the song was no longer a comfort. It was a dirge. It was a poison. Every perfect, sorrowful note was a confirmation of the impossible, a nail in the coffin of her sanity. Clara pressed her ear against the cold plaster of the wall, and this time, beneath the notes of the piano, she could hear something she'd never heard before. The faint, rhythmic creak of a wooden bench, and what sounded like a soft, sorrowful sigh that hung in the air between movements. She was frozen in the dark, a captive audience of one listening to a ghost's nightly, heartbreaking recital, a performance that would never, ever end. To most, Hawaii is just a vacation paradise. But to the locals, it is a land of deep, ancient power where the old gods still rule. Nowhere is this more true than on the Pali Highway, a winding road cutting through the mountains of Oahu. Here, there is one sacred rule that you simply do not break. Never carry pork in your car at night. If you do, you are inviting the wrath of a goddess, and you might find yourself stranded in the dark with something terrifying waiting right outside your window. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Our story takes place in the summer of 2014. It centers on a man named Daniel Kealoha. Daniel was 28 years old, born and raised on the mainland in California. He had moved to Oahu 2 years prior to take a job as a sous chef at a high-end restaurant in Waikiki. Daniel was a modern man. He loved science, he loved logic, and he loved efficiency. He respected the local culture of Hawaii, but he viewed the legends and the superstitions as just that, stories. Folklore. He did not believe in night marchers, he did not believe in shark gods, and he certainly did not believe that a piece of meat could stop a car engine. The restaurant Daniel worked for was preparing for a massive, exclusive private event on the windward side of the island in the town of Kailua. It was a traditional Hawaiian luau, but with a high-end modern twist. The centerpiece of the feast was to be a specific type of high-grade heritage pork, imported specially for the occasion. On the night of August 14th, 2014, Daniel was working late at the restaurant in Waikiki. The event was the next day. There had been a mix-up with the supply trucks, and the special pork shipment had been delivered to the Waikiki location instead of the venue in Kailua. At 11:30 p.m., the head chef grabbed Daniel. He was stressed and frantic. He told Daniel that the pork needed to be in Kailua by morning to begin the slow roasting process. He handed Daniel the keys to the catering van, a reliable, heavy-duty cargo vehicle. He told him to load the pork and drive it over the Pali Highway to the prep kitchen in Kailua. As Daniel began loading the heavy wrapped coolers of raw pork into the back of the van, one of the dishwashers, an older local man named Kimo, stopped him. Kimo saw the pork. He saw the keys, and he looked at Daniel with serious, wide eyes. Kimo told him not to take the Pali. He told him to take the long way around, the coastal road. He said it would add 45 minutes to the drive, but it was safe. He told Daniel that carrying pork over the Pali at night was forbidden. He explained that the Pali was the domain of Pele, the volcano goddess, and that pork was a symbol of Kamapua'a, the pig demigod, who was Pele's bitter rival and former lover. To bring pork into her domain was an act of war. It was an insult. Daniel just smiled. He was tired. He wanted to go home. He told Kimo that he appreciated the concern, but he had a job to do, and he was not going to add an hour to his drive because of a ghost story. He slammed the back doors of the van shut, hopped in the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. He waved at Kimo, who was still standing in the loading dock shaking his head, and pulled out onto the empty streets of Honolulu. The drive began normally. Daniel blasted his music, rolling down the windows to let the warm, tropical air rush in. He navigated the city streets and merged onto the Pali Highway. As he began the ascent up the mountain, the city lights faded behind him. The Pali Highway is not like a normal interstate. As you climb, you enter a different world. The temperature drops. The vegetation becomes thick and ancient. Giant banyan trees hang over the road, creating a tunnel of darkness. The wind picks up, howling through the cliffs. This was the site of the Battle of Nu'uanu in 1795, where King Kamehameha united the islands by forcing hundreds of warriors off the sheer cliffs to their deaths. It is a place soaked in blood and mana. Daniel reached the Nu'uanu Pali tunnels. These are two long, concrete tunnels carved straight through the mountain rock. It was now midnight. The road was completely empty. He was the only car on the mountain. He drove through the tunnels, the orange sodium lights flickering overhead. He exited the second tunnel and began the winding descent toward the windward side. He was making good time. He laughed to himself, thinking about Kimo's warning. The van was running perfectly. And then, everything changed. It started with the sound. The radio, which had been playing loud rock music, suddenly cut out. It was not a fade. It was a hard cut to silence. Then, a high-pitched, screeching static filled the cabin. It was so loud that Daniel instinctively covered his ears and swerved slightly. He reached for the volume knob and turned it all the way down, but the static remained, screaming at a deafening volume. Then, the lights went. The headlights of the van, which were cutting through the pitch-black darkness of the jungle, flickered once, twice, and died. Total darkness. Daniel slammed on the brakes. He was moving at 45 miles an hour on a winding mountain road with no lights. The van skidded, the tires screaming on the asphalt. He fought the wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. The van came to a halt just inches from the guardrail. Beyond that rail was a drop of several hundred feet into the dark jungle below. He sat there in the dark, breathing hard. The static on the radio stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Daniel tried to restart the van. He turned the key. Nothing. The engine did not crank. The dashboard lights did not come on. It was as if the battery had been completely drained of every electron. He hit the steering wheel in frustration. "Great," he muttered. "Just great." He reached for his cell phone. He looked at the screen. No service. This was strange, because the Pali Highway usually had decent coverage, but his phone showed a circle with a line through it. He was stranded, alone, in the middle of the night on the most haunted road in Hawaii. He decided he had to check the engine. Maybe a battery cable had come loose. He grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, opened the driver's side door, and stepped out. The air outside was different. It was cold, unnaturally cold for a Hawaiian summer night, and it smelled distinct. It did not smell like exhaust or jungle rot. It smelled like sulfur, like a match that had just been struck. And underneath the sulfur, there was the faint, sweet scent of flowers, gardenias. Daniel walked to the front of the van. He popped the hood. He shined his flashlight on the engine block. Everything looked perfect. The battery cables were tight. The belts were intact. There was no smoke, no leaking fluid. There was absolutely no mechanical reason for the van to be dead. He slammed the hood shut. He was starting to feel a creeping sense of unease. The silence of the jungle was heavy. Usually, the forest at night is loud with insects and wind. But tonight, it was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just a vacuum of sound. He walked back to the driver's side door. He was about to get in when he saw it. About 50 yards down the road, in the direction he was heading, there was a figure. Daniel froze. He shined his flashlight down the road. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the asphalt. Standing in the middle of the empty highway was a woman. She was facing away from him. She appeared to be wearing a long, white dress or robe that flowed around her legs, even though there was no wind. Her hair was long and white, cascading down her back. "Hey," Daniel called out, his voice sounding thin and weak in the heavy air. "Hey, do you need help? My van broke down." The woman did not move. She did not turn around. And then Daniel noticed something else. Standing next to the woman, sitting perfectly still on the yellow line of the road, was a dog. It was a massive white dog. It was staring directly at Daniel. Its eyes reflected the flashlight beam, glowing a bright, unnatural red. A primal fear, something deep in his lizard brain, triggered a full-blown panic response. Daniel scrambled back into the van. He slammed the door and locked it. He didn't know why, but he felt terrified. He remembered Kimo's story. The woman, the dog, the pork. "No," he said to himself. "That's stupid. It's just a local lady walking her dog. At midnight. On a highway." He tried the key again. Click, click, click. Nothing. He looked out the windshield. The woman and the dog were gone. He let out a breath. Maybe he had hallucinated. Maybe it was a trick of the light. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the headrest. He just needed to wait for a passing car. Someone would come by eventually. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the passenger side window. Daniel screamed and jolted upright. He looked to his right. Standing directly outside the passenger window was the old woman. She was no longer 50 yards away. She was inches from him. Her face was pressed close to the glass. It was a face of impossible age, a map of deep, ancient wrinkles. Her eyes were not white or milky. They were sharp, dark, and burning with a terrifying intelligence. She was not looking at Daniel. She was looking into the back of the van. She was looking directly at the coolers. Daniel felt a coldness wash over him that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He could not move. He could not look away. The woman slowly raised a hand. Her fingers were long and gnarled. She pointed a single finger at the back of the van. Then she pointed at the door. She did not speak, but Daniel heard a voice in his head. It was not a sound. It was a thought that was forced into his mind. It was a command. Get it out. Daniel knew. In that moment, all his skepticism, all his logic, all his science vanished. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew who she was, and he knew what she wanted. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He scrambled over the center console into the back of the van. He moved with the frantic, clumsy energy of pure terror. He grabbed the first cooler. It was heavy, filled with 20 pounds of expensive heritage pork. He dragged it to the side door of the van. He looked out the window. The old woman was gone. But the white dog was sitting right outside the door, watching him, waiting. Daniel unlocked the side door. He threw it open. The smell of sulfur was overpowering now, choking him. He grabbed the cooler. He didn't care about his job. He didn't care about the restaurant. He didn't care about the thousands of dollars of meat. He shoved the cooler out of the van onto the side of the road. The lid popped open, spilling the raw meat onto the asphalt. He went back for the second cooler. He threw it out. He went back for the third. He threw it out. He emptied the entire van. Every single scrap of pork was now lying on the side of the poly highway. He slammed the side door shut. He scrambled back into the driver's seat. He was sweating profusely, his heart racing at a dangerous speed. He looked out the windshield. The road was empty. The dog was gone. The meat lay in a pile on the shoulder. Daniel put his hand on the key. He took a deep breath. "Please," he whispered. "Please." He turned the key. The engine roared to life instantly. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the darkness bright and clear. The radio blasted back on, playing the same rock song as if nothing had happened. Daniel did not wait. He slammed the van into drive and floored it. The tires shrieked as he peeled away from the shoulder, leaving the pile of expensive pork behind him in the red glow of his taillights. He drove like a madman. He did not look in his rearview mirror. He did not slow down until he was off the mountain and in the well-lit streets of Kailua. He pulled into the parking lot of the prep kitchen. He turned off the van and just sat there, shaking, for 20 minutes. He was safe. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had narrowly escaped something far worse than a breakdown. The next morning, Daniel had to explain to the head chef why the pork was gone. He didn't lie. He told him exactly what happened. He expected to be fired. He expected to be laughed at. The head chef, a man who had lived in Hawaii for 10 years, didn't laugh. He just went pale. He asked Daniel exactly where it happened. Daniel described the spot. The chef nodded slowly. "You are lucky," he said quietly. "You are very lucky she let you leave." Daniel was not fired. The restaurant wrote off the loss as spoilage. But Daniel was changed. He continued to work as a chef, but he made a new rule for himself, a rule he followed religiously for the rest of his time in Hawaii. Whenever he had to transport pork, he took the long way. He took the coastal road. He drove the extra 45 minutes. He never, ever drove the poly highway with pork in his car again. And when tourists would ask him about the silly superstition, he wouldn't laugh. He would just look at them with serious eyes and say, "Some rules aren't meant to be broken." And it serves as a powerful reminder for all of us. We live in a world that we think we understand. We map it with satellites, we illuminate it with electric lights, and we pave over it with concrete. We believe that we have tamed the earth. But there are forces that are older than our maps and stronger than our concrete. There is a wisdom in respecting the beliefs and the customs of the places we visit, even if they don't make sense to our logical minds. Because when you enter a place with deep history, you are a guest in a house that is not your own. And just like in any house, there are rules. And sometimes the penalty for breaking those rules is not a fine or a ticket. Sometimes the penalty is finding yourself alone in the dark, facing something that demands a payment you might not be ready to make. So, the next time you are traveling and a local tells you not to do something, listen to them, because they might just be saving you from a very long, very dark walk home. Thanks for watching. We like to think that when someone dies, that is the end of their story. They take their secrets to the grave, buried under 6 feet of heavy dirt. We find comfort in the idea that the dead rest in peace. But what happens when the grave refuses to keep those secrets hidden? What happens when the victim is the only witness to their own murder and they find a terrifying way to testify from beyond the veil to ensure justice is served? In the deep, isolated rolling hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, back in the late 19th century, a young and vibrant woman named Zona Heister died under deeply mysterious circumstances. Her husband was charming and seemingly devastated. Her death was quickly labeled natural by an inexperienced doctor, and she was buried with suspicious haste in the frozen winter ground. It should have ended right there. Zona should have become just another forgotten name on a weathered tombstone in a rural cemetery. But Zona Heaster had a story to tell, a brutal, horrifying story of her final moments on Earth, and she was not going to let a little thing like death stop her from telling it to the one person who would listen. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Our story centers around a young woman named Elva Zona Heaster. In 1896, life in rural West Virginia was incredibly isolating. Communities were small, everyone knew everyone else's business, and outsiders were viewed with a healthy dose of suspicion. Zona was known in her community as a spirited, somewhat headstrong young woman. She had already had one child out of wedlock back in 1895, which in those days was a significant social scandal. Then a drifter rolled into town. His name was Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe. Everyone just called him Trout. He was a blacksmith by trade, a powerfully built man who was charming, smooth-talking, and seemed to have a way with the ladies. He had a mysterious past that he didn't talk about much, but his charisma was enough to make people overlook the fact that he was a stranger. Trout took an immediate interest in Zona. Despite the stern warnings of Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, who instinctively felt there was something dark lurking behind Trout's smiling eyes, Zona fell hard for the blacksmith. Mary Jane later said she felt a deep, inexplicable dread the moment she met him, the kind of mother's intuition that rarely misses the mark. But Zona wouldn't listen. They were married in October of 1896, not long after they met. They moved into a small, two-story house near the local grist mill where Trout worked. For a few months, things seemed relatively quiet on the surface, but the isolation of their home meant that no one really knew what was happening behind closed doors. On January 23, 1897, a bitter winter day, Trout Shoe went to work at the blacksmith shop. Around midday, he asked a young neighborhood boy named Andy Jones if he would run over to the shoe house and see if Zona needed anything from the store. He said she hadn't been feeling well that morning. The young boy trudged through the snow to the house. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the knob, and it was unlocked. He stepped inside, calling out for Mrs. Shoe. The house was painfully silent. He walked through the front room toward the stairs leading to the second floor. There, lying at the foot of the stairs, was Zona. She was stretched out perfectly straight on the floor, her feet together, one hand across her chest. Her head was tilted awkwardly to one side. The boy ran to her, thinking she had just fallen. But when he got close, he saw the fixed stare of her open eyes. Zona was stone dead. Terrified, the boy ran back to the blacksmith shop to tell Trout. According to witnesses, Trout didn't seem shocked. He seemed instantly hysterical. He ran back to the house, but before the local doctor and coroner, Dr. George Knapp, could arrive, Trout did something very strange. Trout carried Zona's body upstairs to their bedroom. By the time Dr. Knapp got there, about an hour later, Trout had already washed the body and dressed Zona in her absolute best Sunday clothes. She was wearing a high-necked dress with a stiff collar, and over that, Trout had wrapped a large scarf around her neck and tied it in a big bow under her chin. Dr. Knapp was a relatively new doctor, and he was intimidated by the large, grieving husband. Trout was cradling Zona's head, crying loudly. Every time Dr. Knapp tried to examine Zona's neck or head to check for injuries from the apparent fall down the stairs, Trout would physically push his hands away. He sobbed that her neck was too sensitive and he couldn't bear for anyone to touch her. Intimidated and not wanting to cause more distress, Dr. Knapp did only a cursory exam of the rest of her body. Finding nothing obvious and taking the husband's word that she had been unwell, Dr. Knapp officially listed the cause of death as an everlasting faint, which was old-time medical speak for a heart attack or sudden cardiac arrest. The funeral took place the very next day. It was rushed, even for those days. Trout Shoe's behavior during the wake and funeral went from strange to downright bizarre. He was manic. He paced back and forth by the open casket. He wouldn't let anyone get too close to Zona. He had placed a small pillow on one side of her head and a rolled-up cloth on the other, insisting it was to make her rest easier. He kept fussing with that large scarf around her neck, tightening it and adjusting the bow. At one point, he famously said to the mourners that Zona was much better off now than she ever was in life. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, watched all of this with a burning suspicion. She knew in her gut her daughter hadn't just died of a faint. She noticed how quickly Trout wanted Zona in the ground. She noticed how he guarded the body. After the body was removed from the house for burial, Mary Jane took the sheet that had been inside the coffin. She tried to wash it, and something terrifying happened. The water in the basin turned entirely red, as if it were blood. Yet when she pulled the sheet out, there was no stain on it. But the water smelled metallic and foul. To Mary Jane, this was a sign from God that something evil had happened. Zona was buried in the Souls Chapel Cemetery. Trout immediately began acting like a man without a care in the world, which only fueled Mary Jane's fury. Every night for weeks, Mary Jane prayed. She prayed fervently, desperately asking God to reveal the truth about what happened to her daughter. She asked for a sign. She asked for justice. 4 weeks after the funeral, Mary Jane got her answer. It started on a cold February night. Mary Jane was in bed when she woke up to a strange light filling her room. It wasn't moonlight or lamplight. It was a cold, piercing white light. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was Zona. But it wasn't the Zona she knew in life. This figure was pale, almost translucent, and radiating an intense coldness that made Mary Jane shiver under her heavy quilts. The ghost of Zona began to speak, but not with her voice. It was as if the words were being placed directly into Mary Jane's mind. For 4 consecutive nights, the ghost of Zona Heaster visited her mother. On the first few nights, the ghost recounted the abuse she had suffered at the hands of Trout Shue. She talked about his violent temper, how he would snap over the smallest things. She revealed that he had been married twice before. His first wife had divorced him on grounds of extreme cruelty. His second wife had died under mysterious circumstances, allegedly from falling off a haystack, but the ghost intimated it was murder. On the 4th and final night, the ghost revealed the gruesome details of her own death. She told her mother that on the day she died, Trout had come home for lunch. He was in a foul mood because she hadn't cooked any meat for his meal. An argument started. Trout, in a blind rage, grabbed her by the throat. The ghost described the crushing pressure of his massive hands. She couldn't breathe. She tried to fight back, but he was too strong. And then, with a violent, wrenching motion, he snapped her neck. To prove the truth of her words, the ghost of Zona did something that seared itself into Mary Jane's memory forever. The ghost stood at the foot of the bed and slowly, horrifyingly, turned her head completely around until it was facing backward between her shoulder blades, showing her mother exactly how broken her neck was. Then the spirit vanished, leaving Mary Jane alone in the freezing darkness, armed with a terrifying truth. Mary Jane knew nobody would believe her. A ghost story wouldn't hold up in court, but she was a mother possessed by a need for justice. She went to the local prosecutor, a man named John Alfred Preston. You can imagine how that conversation went. An older woman from the hills comes into a prosecutor's office claiming her dead daughter's ghost solved her own murder. Preston was skeptical. He tried to gently dismiss her. But Mary Jane was relentless. She was articulate, she was specific, and her conviction was unshakable. She recounted details that only someone who was there could know. She talked about the bruise on Zona's neck that Trout had covered with the scarf. She talked about the specific vertebrae that were broken. Preston, against his better judgment, started poking around. He talked to Dr. Knapp, who admitted he hadn't really done a thorough exam because Trout was being so aggressive. He talked to neighbors who had heard yelling from the house. The rumors in town were already swirling about Trout's strange behavior at the funeral. Facing mounting pressure from the community and the undeniable intensity of Mary Jane's testimony, Prosecutor Preston made a bold move. He ordered Zona's body to be exhumed. On February 22nd, 1897, in the dead of winter, a group of men dug up Zona's coffin. Trout Shue was forced to be there. Witnesses said he complained the entire time, saying it was disrespectful and unnecessary. They took the coffin to a nearby one-room schoolhouse to perform the autopsy. Dr. Knapp was there, along with two other more experienced physicians. They opened the casket. Zona's body was remarkably well preserved due to the freezing temperatures. And just as the ghost had told her mother, when they removed the high-collared dress and the large scarf that Trout had insisted on, they found distinct finger marks and bruising on her neck. But the real proof came when the doctors examined her spine. The autopsy report stated that Zona's neck had been broken between the first and second vertebrae. The ligaments were completely torn and the windpipe had been crushed. It was a catastrophic injury. The doctors concluded unanimously that this could not have happened from a simple fall down the stairs. It was a violent, manual strangulation that resulted in a broken neck. The ghost had told the truth. Trout Shue was immediately arrested and charged with murder. The trial took place in late June of 1897, and it was an absolute sensation. People traveled for miles to pack the courthouse. It was the O.J. Simpson trial of the 19th century in West Virginia. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial, except for one key witness, Mary Jane Heaster. When she took the stand, the defense attorney tried to tear her apart. He ridiculed her. He asked her if she believed in ghosts, trying to make her look like a hysterical, superstitious backwoods woman. But Mary Jane stood her ground. Her testimony was riveting. She recounted the 4 nights of visitation in unwavering detail. She didn't stumble. She didn't contradict herself. She looked the jury in the eye and told them exactly what her daughter's spirit had told her. The defense attorney made a fatal mistake. He asked her a question meant to trap her. "Mrs. Heaster, are you telling this jury that my client, Mr. Shue, is guilty of murder solely because a ghost told you so?" Mary Jane replied with chilling composure, "I am telling this jury that the doctors found my daughter's neck broken exactly as her spirit told me it was. The ghost told me the truth when the living man told me lies." The jury was out for only a little over an hour. They returned a verdict of guilty. Because the evidence was largely circumstantial and based on ghost testimony, they didn't give him the death penalty. Trout Shue was sentenced to life in prison at the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville. Trout didn't last long in prison. He died 3 years later, in 1900, during a measles epidemic. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Zona Heaster Shue was finally laid to rest in peace. Her tombstone stands today in the Souls Chapel Cemetery, and if you go there, you will see a metal plaque erected by the state of West Virginia. It reads in part, "Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue." Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. It remains the only known case in American legal history where the testimony of a ghost was admitted as evidence in a murder trial and helped secure a conviction. This story serves as a chilling reminder that nothing in this life is truly hidden forever. We may think we can bury our misdeeds in the dark earth, cover them with lies, and move on as if nothing happened. But truth has a powerful way of clawing its way to the surface, sometimes in ways we cannot rationally explain. There is an ultimate accountability that no human being can escape. If justice is not served by the living, sometimes the universe ensures it is served by other means. The truth will always find a light to shine through the deepest darkness. All right, that brings us to the end of that story. However, I have another one lined up that is every bit as gripping as the last, so make sure you stick around until the end. Imagine a criminal who doesn't want to hide in the shadows. Instead, they want the entire world to watch their every move. Now imagine this criminal isn't a person, but a ghost, a faceless group that calls itself the Monster with 21 Faces. For 18 months, this phantom entity held the entire nation of Japan hostage. They kidnapped the CEO of a billion-dollar company, poisoned candy, and put it back on store shelves for children to find. And all the while, they sent taunting, playful letters to the police and the media, turning their crime spree into a terrifying national drama. They were always one step ahead, and in the end, they simply announced they were bored of the game and vanished forever, leaving behind one of the most baffling and audacious unsolved cases in the history of crime. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Our story begins in the spring of 1984 in the prosperous and orderly nation of Japan. At the head of one of the country's largest and most beloved candy companies, Ezaki Glico was its president, a 42-year-old man named Katsuhisa Ezaki. Glico was a household name, famous for iconic snacks like Pocky and Pretz. Ezaki lived a comfortable life with his wife Mariko and their 3 children in a wealthy suburb of Nishinomiya. On the evening of March 18th, he was enjoying a relaxing bath at home after a long day. He had no idea that his quiet, successful life was about to be shattered, and that he was about to become the first pawn in a bizarre and terrifying game. At around 9 p.m., 2 masked men, armed with guns and a key, quietly let themselves into his mother's house, which was right next door to his own. They tied up his 70-year-old mother and forced her to give them the key to her son's home. A few minutes later, Ezaki's wife Mariko heard a noise and came downstairs to find the 2 masked intruders in her home. They brandished their weapons and told her they wouldn't harm her or the children if she just stayed quiet. One of the men then cut the phone lines while the other went upstairs. He kicked open the bathroom door to find a shocked Katsuhisa Ezaki. They dragged him from his bath, naked and dripping, and threw him into the shower. They told him they wanted money, 1 billion yen, the equivalent of about 10 million US dollars at the time, and 10 kilograms of gold bullion. Before he could even process the demand, they hustled him out of his own home, wrapped him in a blanket, and forced him into a waiting car. The president of the Glico Candy Company had been kidnapped from his own bathroom. The next day, the kidnappers sent a ransom note to the company demanding the massive sum of money, but the kidnappers, whoever they were, had underestimated their victim. Ezaki was not a man who would sit and wait for his fate to be decided. He was being held in a small, windowless room in what he believed to be an abandoned warehouse. After 3 days in captivity, he saw his chance. He managed to loosen his restraints, and when his captors were distracted, he made a break for it. He burst out of the warehouse and ran for his life, eventually making it to a nearby road and flagging down help. He had escaped. For the police and the Glico company, it was a moment of immense relief. The crisis was over, but they were wrong. The crisis was just beginning. The kidnappers hadn't just lost their hostage, they had been publicly embarrassed, and now they wanted revenge. This is when the criminals adopted their now famous persona. A few weeks after the escape, letters began to arrive at newspaper offices and police stations across Japan. They were from the kidnappers, but they were now writing under a new name, a name taken from a famous series of Japanese detective novels by the author Edogawa Rampo. They called themselves Kaijin Nijuichi Menso, which translates to the monster with 21 faces. Their letters were unlike any ransom notes the police had ever seen. They were not just demanding, they were theatrical, arrogant, and filled with a strange, dark sense of humor. They were written in a folksy, sometimes childish dialect, and they were filled with insults aimed at the police and the media. One of their early letters read, "To the dumb police, are you stupid? There are so many of you, what are you doing? If you were professionals, you would have caught us. Your abilities are so bad, we will give you a hint." This was their style. They weren't just criminals, they were performers, and all of Japan was their unwilling audience. Their first public act of terror was a direct attack on the Glico company. They sent a letter to the media announcing that they had laced Glico candy products with potassium cyanide, a deadly poison, and placed them back on store shelves. The announcement caused immediate and widespread panic. Japan is a country where food safety is taken incredibly seriously, and the idea of poisoned snacks aimed at children was a national nightmare. Glico had no choice but to pull all of its products from every store in the country. The company lost over $20 million and had to lay off hundreds of workers. The monster had failed to get their ransom, so they had inflicted a different kind of pain, bringing a corporate giant to its knees. After a few months of tormenting Glico, the monster went silent. The public began to hope the nightmare was over. But then, in September, they returned, this time with a new target, another major food company called Morinaga. Their tactics were the same. They sent letters demanding money, and when the demands weren't met, they escalated to public terror. But this time, they did something even more sinister. They didn't just claim times to have poisoned the candy, they showed the world they had actually done it. They sent letters to news outlets across the country, telling them the exact stores, and in some cases, the exact locations on the shelves where they had placed the poisoned products. A frantic race would begin, with reporters and police officers rushing to the named stores, and they would find them. Boxes of Morinaga candy, just as the monster had described, but with a new, professionally printed label on them that read, in Japanese, "Danger contains toxins. You will get sick if you eat this." The monster with 21 faces. It was a brilliant and diabolical act of psychological warfare. They weren't actually trying to kill anyone. They were proving that they times could asterisk. They were showing the entire country that they had the power to place poison in the hands of any child at any time. The fear was palpable. Candy sales plummeted across the country. Stores started pulling all Morinaga products from their shelves. The monster was in complete control. They expanded their campaign, sending threatening letters to Marudai Ham and House Foods Corporation, two other massive food companies. The Japanese food industry was in a state of siege. The National Police Agency, meanwhile, was engaged in the largest and most frustrating manhunt in the country's history. They had over 1,000 investigators working the case full-time. But they were chasing a ghost. The monster was incredibly skilled at covering their tracks. The letters were typed on an old Japanese typewriter, making them untraceable. They used public payphones for their calls. But the police did have a few agonizingly close calls. On two separate occasions, they arranged for a money drop with the criminals. Both times, the police were outsmarted. In one instance, a police officer was instructed to board a train and look for a man carrying a white flag. He was then supposed to follow that man to the drop-off point. The officer boarded the train, but he described the scene as chaotic, with so many people that he couldn't properly identify the contact. The drop was a failure. Their best, and ultimately most frustrating, lead came in the form of a security camera video. After the monster had claimed to have poisoned candy in a grocery store, police reviewed the security tapes. On the video, they saw a man in a baseball cap and glasses placing a box of Glico chocolate on a shelf. The man was ordinary looking, with neatly combed hair and a slight build. But witnesses who had seen him in the store described his eyes as being like those of a fox. The police released a sketch of the man, who immediately became known as the Fox-Eyed Man. His face was plastered on every television screen and in every newspaper in Japan. He became the public face of the monster, but despite the nationwide manhunt, he was never identified. The crime spree continued for 18 long, terrifying months. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. In August of 1985, the monster sent their final letter to the media. The tone was, once again, bizarrely nonchalant. It read, "Japan has become hot and humid, so we decided to forget about torturing food companies. After this, we will not threaten any more companies." They mocked the police one last time for their failures and then ended the letter with a strange, almost childish sign-off. "We are bad guys," which means we have more things to do than bully companies. It is fun to lead a bad man's life. The monster with 21 faces. And with that, they were gone. They never sent another letter. They never made another threat. The most notorious criminal entity in Japanese history had simply announced they were finished playing their game and had vanished back into the shadows from which they came. The case went cold, but the story has one final, tragic chapter. 1 year after the monster's final letter, in August of 1986, the police superintendent in charge of the investigation, a man named Yamamoto, walked into his backyard and took his own life. He left a note expressing his deep shame and sorrow for having failed to catch the monster. It was the ultimate, heartbreaking victory for the criminals. They had not only gotten away with their crimes, but they had driven the man hunting them to his death. To this day, the identity of the monster with 21 faces remains completely unknown. Were they a single, disgruntled person with a grudge against the food industry? Or were they a sophisticated criminal organization? The skill and planning involved suggest a group, but the unique singular voice in the letters suggests a single mastermind. They terrorized a nation, caused over $1 billion in economic damages, and ran circles around the police for a year and a half, all without ever being caught. They played their game, they won, and then they simply walked away, leaving behind a strange, dark, and utterly baffling mystery.